this event is to celebrate more than just the book. The book is a project, and I'm going to hand over to Peter Mumford to kick it off for the ALD.
I should do my best. I don't know how familiar everybody is with the Right Light, but just to tell you a little bit of the background of it. Nick always says this is everybody's book, and that's very generous of him. And certainly there's a wide area of contribution from a number, I don't know exactly how many.
19.
19, there you go. 19 lighting designers in this country. But it's very much his idea and very much his concept. And it's an interesting publication, I think, because he's selected a range of views and opinions, but also given those opinions subject matter, points for discussion, and very cleverly, in my opinion, connected the whole thing with his own views and with his own attitude towards lighting design, but leaving it open to interpretation. And it's kind of great because, yes, it does belong to everybody who's participated in one sense, but it wouldn't work unless it was actually put together. So it amounts to, I don't know if you'd call it a series of essays, perhaps it's certainly a series of ideas about how lighting works, how lighting design works, what it is as an art form, or maybe in some cases, is it an art form? I think one of the questions that's asked in there. And I think it makes very interesting reading because it gives you a huge perspective in a way that I don't know of any other publication has on what's actually going on, what people think, how they work, how they approach the whole area, and to some extent what the results are. It's interesting to me that it has no illustrations. It's all about ideas, and I think it's very interesting to see a publication that is philosophical in that sense, that actually looks at what people have to say about their work, when all of the people who are involved in it are actually visual artists in that sense. So I think it's a great piece of work, and I highly recommend it to everybody. I'm sure it will become a definitive piece of reading in terms of education and students, but I think it goes much broader than that, and it's of interest to all of us. It interests me. I mean, I'm one of those 19, but it interests me very much to see what other people have to say about similar subjects. Interesting to see how views have developed over time, and how they've become, in many ways, much more sophisticated in terms of attitudes towards a creative form. So all I can say is I would thoroughly recommend it. I think it's a great project. It's a very well conceived, very well edited and put together piece of work. Now, our first panel comprises Michael Hulls, Mark Jonathan, Nick Richards, and Paul Pine. And I think that's going to be open to us. You're going to introduce this further now.
So the format of the afternoon, we're going to have two panels, as Peter said. First one will be in a few minutes, and then we'll have a comfort break, and then we'll have a second panel with Mark Jonathan, Michael Hulls, and Nick Richards, which will be facilitated by got this totally wrong. That breaks the formality of it, doesn't it? So yes, the first panel is around the subject of collaboration, and that'll be in about 5 minutes. And the second panel is around the subject of is it art? In what ways is it art? So that will be in about an hour's time. And then we've got a little bit of a reception, a few drinks, but we have to be out of the building by 5, just so you know. A little bit about the project, and thank you, Peter, that's very kind words. It couldn't have happened without the collaboration, the generous collaboration of all 19 of the lighting designers that I interviewed. It was the basis of the interviews, which lasted between 90 minutes and in one case all afternoon, with a tea break, was with the same set of questions essentially, and the original idea of the project was that each pair of lighting designers would talk about a particular area of work. So there might be two people talking about drama, two about lighting for opera. But everybody does everything, and it's interesting what they say about the things. So it turned into something which was much more about taking the reader through the process of creating lighting design on stage. And then we had a specialist chapter on dance because, well, mostly because of Michael Hulls and Lucy, it has to be said. And we'll get onto that later on, I hope. The other sort of inspiration for it, really, and it's James Funk, was something that a colleague of mine at Central, who teaches in a completely different area, but she came up with this idea of the integrative practitioner. That is somebody who is not just doing it, but engaged in doing it in certain ways, and the ways in which they're engaged in doing it are not clear and obvious. And the thing that I really liked about her work was this little statement, the choices may be simple, but behind them lies a lot of complexity. And I think that does typify a lot of the work that we do. You know, it looks really simple to just bring up this light. Also in the book, I talked about some reasons why, if lighting design is so important, why is it so rarely written about well? And there was an article in The Guardian only last week by a journalist who'd followed Paulie Constable around, and said some very interesting things, but he also said some rubbish. And it's interesting how there can still be this concept that, you know, not very many shows have lighting designers, apparently, because most shows, the director or the designer gets a technician to do what they want. That's what he wrote, essentially, which Joe pointed out and I put on Facebook, meanwhile back in the 21st century. But that's what people think. They genuinely think that. And the comments that came after that article were also interesting, because one of them said, "What are you making all this fuss about? Surely it's just about putting the right sort of light on where the actors are." And there was a comment after that which went, "Yes, but that's not simple." And it's that sort of level of complexity that I really wanted more people to understand, and including our theatrical collaborators, the directors and the designers and the other people that we work with. I think, when I have been lighting a show, I've always been blessed with technicians and programmers who really understood what I was trying to do, and I think that's great. It doesn't always happen, I know, but it's not those people that we need to talk to, really, because I think we do spend a lot of time talking to them and they do get it by and large. But it's still quite frustrating to come across directors who really don't understand what is going on when you're trying to light a show, and how much grief they are causing you by changing a piece of blocking or shuffling the order of two scenes, or all kinds of other things that they think of as being relatively simple and trivial, suddenly become enormously complicated because it's impacting on what we do. Anyway, enough from me. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome, first of all, Kelly Zazulka to join us up here with our first panel, which is Mr. Farncombe, who's just come in from the airport. Do you want to catch your breath, dear?
No, all right.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Sorry, lost my place. Marco Mr. Hulls and Mr. Richards. Please welcome them to the stage.
Maybe you just go off the plane.
Hi everyone, this first panel, as Nick said, we're going to talk about collaboration and particularly communication between your fellow collaborators. I'll just say a few words about who I am and then I'll let the panel introduce themselves. I'm Kelly Zazulka. I'm a freelance writing designer and also a PhD student at the University of Leeds and editor of the ALD's magazine Focus.
My name's James Farncombe. I'm a freelance lighting designer.
Mark Jonathan, freelance lighting designer.
Michael Hulse, freelance lighting designer, specifically in dance.
And Nick Richings, not in dance, but anything else.
I imagine the reason that Nick has asked me to chair this particular panel is because my research for my PhD deals a lot with language, the language of light, but specifically the language of lighting designers. So the language that lighting designers use when talking with their collaborators, how they discuss their work, how they discuss their ideas, how they articulate them to various people, but also how lighting designers use language as a really powerful form of agency, and how you can manipulate language to kind of get what you want in a collaborative situation, which I think could be a really powerful tool for lighting designers. So that's kind of my background and why I think I'm here probably. And it's interesting, so Nick was talking about the reasons that he thinks that light doesn't get written about very often. And he gives 4 reasons, and actually 2 of them are really closely related to language. The first one is because we can't see light, he says. So light doesn't have a materiality of its own, it's not a tangible substance, so it makes it a really difficult thing to talk about and to describe and to articulate. And the third one, he says, is the limitations of language. And I think this is probably, they're both kind of tied in to each other, in that sometimes there isn't the language to kind of say what it is that you're getting across or the feeling that you're going for. There's, particularly in terms of this book talking about the right light, sometimes you just feel that it's the right light and you can't quite articulate why, it just is. So Nick's asked me to introduce this just by talking a little bit about my research into a linguistic phenomenon called code switching, and how this relates to what lighting designers do. So you primarily see code switching in bi- or multilingual contexts. So it's when bilingual speakers switch between languages. So you might have someone who's fluent in Spanish and English, and they can quite fluidly switch between the two in conversation. And there's a kind of recently evolved definition of code switching that takes into account different registers of English as well. And so this is where I'm using it in my research. There are different types of English that we use. And this code switching, sometimes people think it's a sign of linguistic weakness, like you can't quite think of the word in one language, so you switch to the other one. And actually that's not how it happens. Code switchers actually employ really high levels of competency in the languages that they switch between. So you can probably see where I'm headed with this in terms of lighting design. So code switching often occurs in relation to race, gender, or socioeconomic status, but it's also can be determined by situation or location. So the way that you speak at work, for instance, is going to be different from the way you speak at home, or formal versus informal situations. So part of my research looks at how lighting designers navigate this language and how they kind of sit between the artistic language of the designer and the director, and the technical language of programmers and technicians and lighting plans and beam angles and all of that stuff. and I'm especially interested in the technical rehearsal process. And the thing I think that really clearly demonstrates the skill of the lighting designer is if you think of the layout of a production desk. So I always think of the lighting designer as a kind of conduit from the artistic to the technical, and where they sit in the middle of that. And if you think of a typical production desk, you quite often have the lighting designer near an aisle where the director can get to them, and so the director's there, and then the lighting designer, and then the programmer's always to the right. And so the lighting designer is a literal and a metaphorical conduit between these two types of language. So that's kind of how I think of it. And Nick actually summarizes this really well in the book. I'll just read just a paragraph that I think summarizes this really well. He says, the people lighting designers collaborate with fall into two camps: fellow creative team members, including in many instances performers, and those who provide technical and other support directly and indirectly for the realization of lighting designers' work. One of the skills required of theatre lighting designers today is to be able to talk to both of these groups of collaborators in a language each understands and respects. While most directors and set designers are not interested in talking about the technical detail of how a particular volume of light has been created, most technicians expect precise specifications for the equipment involved, and the light designer must master communication with both groups of collaborators. So that's kind of where we're going to start this conversation. And we'll start, as the chapter of the book does as well, in talking about communicating with directors and set designers, particularly in that kind of pre-production period, the pre-tech period, and Michael, I guess in your case, with choreographers. So yeah, if you just, I want to say just a few words about how you kind of approach that kind of initial ideas, how you start to have that conversation with the director and the designer.
Okay, I'll pick it up. I suppose I'm atypical in this because I'm largely working with Russell Malafant, and we've worked together for since about 1990. So we have a huge history that we can refer to, whether that's our own work or other people's work that we've both seen. And because when we started to work together, it was specifically with for the purpose of making a collaboration between light and dance. So I guess from the very off we were developing a kind of language that each of us could understand, because we're both trying to, describe something that we've agreed on, and it's sometimes that that language is quite abstract, and just for an example, that we might talk about something being a bit or and I guess so. I mean, it's not all kind of I don't know, Teletubby kind of language or whatever, but it goes way beyond words. And I guess that both of those, what we're describing is energy, basically. Now, how literal that might be, or that might be, because that we're dealing in non-narrative. There's no narrative that we can refer to, but we're just making something that involves abstract lighting and dance and putting them together. So it's right for being able to talk about because a lot of the time what we're dealing with is and we're working, I mean, in like 40-something productions that we've made together. Twice we've had an element of a set, and the rest of the time we're working in the basis that we're in the complete darkness. We're in blackout. We can't see anything. until we have some light out there. And so literally there's a kind of metaphor for space not existing until there's energy. That's typical of kind of physics in the universe, that we only know that there's space out there because there's energy, whether that, visible or not. So that's why I guess a lot of the time it's about energy, and that's what's creating space, literally, through light. And we talk a lot about movement, because we want the light to move. We want there to be a choreography of light, in the way that there's a choreography of, dance, and that the real, I guess the real kind of nub of the collaboration is about the use of space and how space is used. And particularly that's because Russell works from inside the body outwards. So it's about energy and how that comes out from inside. So he's not making steps. It's about a way of moving coming from deep inside somebody's core, and it's working out from that core out through their limbs and their energy, and spiraling and twisting or whatever into space beyond it. So he's working, that's his kind of starting point. It's not a spatial starting point. It's to do with something, energies coming out from inside. And so that's why, for me, then, to be able to choreograph the space. And so a lot of the language is about the space. And let's take all those bits that move to the left and take out all the other stuff from that material and put that material together to make something else. But all the stuff that moves to the left, we can create a spatial, dynamic that works with that. So, yeah. And let's all go that way. It's not very intellectual. But it's yeah, we've managed to get away with it for like 25 years now. So. But it's because we want to make this thing where they're the light and the dance are interdependent, that neither really makes sense without the other. But then there's a whole process that is kind of atypical as well, that has to happen to be able to do that.
So I imagine it'd be quite different for the rest of the
Completely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so different to do from to doing The Sound of Music that opens you have to open on a Monday night. I mean, there is a completely different set of rules that we have to try and work out. And normally it's down to the logistics of getting the show on and trying to make it look as good as possible. And so most of the things I do for commercial touring have a different starting point, and it's never about it's damage limitation often, as opposed to trying to make something as exciting as that sounds. I would love to do something like that, but it's so often that, as I say, if you've got The Sound of Music, you know that you have to have Von Trapp's house, you have to have a various number of 6-7 scenes that have to be lit, that have to come, and there's a collaboration normally between the set designer and the set designer and the director before I come on board, which is normally, I don't tend to get involved with it. I tend to get involved once that dialogue's happened, and I normally come in from the set designer's perspective, because that is normally my relationship is normally with the set designer. Occasionally it's more with the director, but normally it's with the set designer, and then we build up from there, and then get into director, choreographer, and all the rest of it. And it's for me, it's easy to use much simpler language, like to refer to something like say, do you want it to look like a film noir? Do you want it to look like something that has a reference in an easier way of speaking? Do you want it to look naturalistic? Do you want it to look impressionistic? It's words that are more general, and then it gives me a starting point of where it is, where we're going. Quite often, it's obvious because the set is, it has a rake of 45 degrees and crazy, weird angles going on, and you know that's going to be the style. You know from seeing the basic drawings or the white card model or some impressions that the set designer's done, where you're going with that piece, and then it's about how to facilitate that and make that work within the confines of getting it on and up in time and making it look right, and being able to reproduce it every week the same and make it have a standard that is reproducible. So that's so it's a completely different set of rules that I have to go into.
Slightly more like reactive approach as
Yeah.
opposed to Michael's proactive approach.
Well, also, I guess because what I'm describing is creating what is already there, the sound of music, and we're actually kind of
You're correct, yeah, absolutely.
lighting that.
Sometimes, obviously, I do get involved in new projects with the books change and things move around, but most of what I do is existing material, whether it's a 1930s play that's been revived, an old Ractagon, or a Shakespearean play. It's have a new take on it, but the material exists in the first place 90% of the time. So it's a different set of rules.
James, you work quite a bit in rewriting.
I have done.
Yeah. Do you find that the process is the same if that's something that's been done before?
I was going to say, because there's a sort of counterpoint to what Michael said, because what he's describing is something I think we all really value, which is the shorthand that you get from working with the same people for a long time. Coincidentally, for me, over the last 3 or 4 years, I've been working with a lot of new directors. So I've had to sort of take on, I've learned that people can't really talk about light, that it's something very ephemeral and it's very difficult to talk and communicate. So I've had to actively taken on the role of a bit of a detective to try and figure out what on earth they want and to pin them down when they're talking about their aesthetic. And especially with some of the directors I work with, they've got a heck of a schedule. So nailing them down to actually start thinking about and talking about in a sort of coherent way is quite tricky. So I've had to try and learn to be as concise with my questions and as just to try and unpick what that might be. Because I think for some people, they just sort of feel that it's obvious, but it's not. You have to really get under the skin of something, and that is part of the job, which I've only really identified in recent few years, I suppose.
I like that you use the word detective, which is quite interesting. So I was going to, Marco, in one of the quotes in the book, you said lighting designers have to be chameleons and how we relate to creative collaborators, which I think is a nice way to describe what we do.
Yes, and it's interesting that we are talking about the conversations that we have, because I certainly subscribe to seeking out what are the right words to use with that director or with that choreographer. And that I can recall working with a director who I thought was very bound by the words. He was a wordsmith, a very brilliant director, but I was using a different style of vocabulary than I would use with a choreographer. But with all of them, I realised that probably we've got our own language that we use with the technicians. And if we talk about a colour and an angle of light and even an intensity, most of the people in this room could visualise what I'm talking about. But that doesn't extend very often into directors, designers or choreographers. So our creative counterparts. And so it's how you have that conversation. I like to be a sponge at the beginning and just soak up what they've got to say and see what that gives me and what does that translate in my mind into the contribution the lighting might make. But I got my fingers burnt just this year, after doing this for decades, where we'd had some conversations, and I do like to, I think it's good to socialise over those conversations as well, if you can. That sounds like you're just telling us really quick ones, but let's have a few drinks or a meal. Let's not have our first conversation at the production desk, which I've seen happen, especially if it's a difficult one, where they go, don't like your light.
Yeah, that's the kind of the worst thing.
It is.
That's not what I imagined at all.
Yeah.
That's the sort of
Yeah, well, I had
worst
a famous American film director who said, well, it doesn't look like whatever artist he told me to have to look like. And, you know, and on you go. But there I was quite recently, and we had the benefit of putting the entire set up, and we were able to, you know, do a bow probe where we pointed lights at it. We did quite a bit of focusing before the first day of rehearsals, when the entire set was going to be trucked into the rehearsal room. So everything was on our side. And I showed the designer, who was in another world at the time, some ideas that I was going to use. And then it was only when I was up against it with no time to light it that the voice from behind me went, I don't like that.
I think that's another thing I think you say in the book, something about the technical rehearsal being a really like exposing period
Yeah.
for lighting designers. That you said it's like akin to standing naked on a table going,
Yeah.
what do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it really is,
Isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, so my tip, about tips and tricks, is, my tip would be to try and diffuse that a bit. I mean, it's really nice when you've got collaborators, where you've already got your shorthand and you don't have to prove anything, but to try and have good conversations before you get to the production days.
But also, it's really handy to have tangible references. Isn't it? So if
Yeah.
the director says, "Go and see this film," then that's kind of gold dust. If
Yeah.
you get given
Yes.
photographs, that's gold dust. You can actually see something. Like, it's really, I've been in the situations where I've had those conversations over a meal and thought that I'd understood, and then I get the kind of email with the photograph or the film to watch and go, "Oh, this is entirely different." And then
Yeah.
having that tangible reference is kind of save the day. But having said all that, there is also the thing that once you can't really know for sure until you're actually in the theatre making the thing,
Yeah.
and if you've got something in front of you that you can react to, and that's always the risky bit.
Yeah.
There's the chance that it's going to not work out.
That's the exposing thing, where you can't just show them a little picture in your notebook or a little model.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that makes what we do unique in the process, is that there isn't, no matter how good visualization suites you get, they're not the actor in their costume on the set in that space. And that in the same way that you can't, you know, a costume designer can show you swatches, or, you know, you go to a costume fitting and you can see
Yeah.
how it,
Yeah.
nothing like that exists for us. So it's a really difficult thing, isn't it, before you get in? You just have to trust
Yeah.
that when you get there, it's going to do what you want it to do.
And when it doesn't, move on. And when you don't know what to do, say, leave that one with me. Let's come back
Leave it with me.
come back to that tomorrow.
I'll make a note.
I've spent hours, you know, going no, getting no, don't like that either. Just move on, leave it, come back to it another day. I think.
So when you get into the space then, how does or do you notice that your style of communication changes, particularly with directors and designers? We'll move on to the other people in the process in a bit, but particularly with directors and designers. Does
Well,
it change?
I like Nick's technique, which we were talking about earlier.
Bugger off. Leave me to it. Go away. I'll come back when I've finished. Is normally what I say, because so often you're doing that and you're looking at it for the first time, along with the director and the choreographer, and they've all got these bright ideas. And you go, no shit, Sherlock. I'm not honestly not going to leave it in this terrible state. You go through a process of trying, particularly with techs that are getting shorter and equipment that's getting more complicated, you're trying to cram an amazing amount of technical info to the rest of your team in a very short time. And there will be some bits which you know yourself you can fix really easily, some bad bit of front of house focusing, whatever. And you've just got to persuade the director that you know what you're doing. I think once you've done that, you're halfway through to solving the problems, because very quickly you can analyse what is the desperate things that need doing. And if you've only got an hour, you'll cut your losses and do the really important things, so that when you go back for the next session, if you have an hour and a half break in between and you've got 35 minutes that you can do some odd jobs, you can do it, and then the next session, next tech session, is suddenly so much better because you've actually got to see the rig working for the first time, you've got to see actors on stage, you've got to see the costumes for the first time, and so many of these variables, you don't know what they're like in the rehearsal room until you're on stage. So my biggest thing is to tell the director, don't worry about the first tech session, just you get on with getting them in the right place, tell me where, and if I need to shout stop, I will. But really, please don't comment until at least Tech 2 or Tech 3. And that's how I get through it. And normally by that point I've caught up. But the first tech session is a road crash, always is. I don't know how you get on with it, but I guess it's a different view where if you've collaborated from day one. But
no, it can still end up as a road crash. There's a couple of years ago, there was a particular thing with Russell, and we've worked together a long, long time, and you see the dancers doing something, and we talk about it, and we're lighting it, and often, actually, whether it's whatever the session is called, we're just as quickly as possible getting on with running material with lights, and only stopping if you really, really have to. But there's the classic was, okay, so we've just seen this happen. So okay, now that's how it's going to be then. The 5 of them, and you know, it takes that amount of time and this and that, and because I'll change what if we agree on that, I'll change. We need to change. Stop now. Need a bit of time to replot this kind of sequence of follow-on so that it matches up with what we've just agreed. And okay, all right. So I get on with someone at the desk and we do all that. And Russell's talking to the dancers, and they say, okay, we're ready, let's give it a go. And then they do something completely different. Because you should have said, don't talk to the dancers, go outside, stop. But no, and this and so, hang on, yeah, they're doing something completely different now, and then get stuck in a loop where you just okay, let's just stop because let's move on to something else because this is too fluid, right now. We have to do it.
I've been in Denmark where they have a different way of working, and everybody then fixes every problem. So we've all ended up fixing the problems and made it worse again. So that also happens. That was a much more difficult process because I wasn't used to the way that the Danish director worked. He worked in a very Danish way, not in the British way. So it's just become a problem.
So how do you deal with when you find yourself in a slightly difficult situation you have to kind of deal with tactfully in terms of the kind of how you diffuse a tricky situation?
Well, I think the diffusing takes place in the bar afterwards. Or leave it with me. I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
But it's also part of reminding the people involved that there is a process. Like you say,
Yeah.
it's very public. It's very last minute. Everything we do before we get on stage is sort of hypothetical and educated guesswork, and a little bit of basic geometry, but it's basically educated guesswork. And reminding people that you're actually going through a process, and especially the way I work, because I tend to sort of just throw things until something sticks, and then there's a sort of distillation process that takes place where I take away all the extraneous stuff, and that takes days, weeks, sometimes weeks if we've got the time. I sort of feel like the actors and the singers, whoever they are, have had their 6 weeks in rehearsal room. And I remember working for when I first started out, I was assistant to Chris Ellis, and he used to say this thing like, he used to get really uptight and irate in tech when people used to come and give him notes when it was too soon. And he'd say, do I walk into the rehearsal room on the first day when you're sitting around in a circle with the script on your knee and say, is this how it's going to be? Because it's a bit crap. That was sort of really good. That's a really good analogy, but that's how it feels when you're like sitting down for the first time. And then the tension kind of builds really quickly, and you have to sort of find ways of just saying, look, just don't worry. I'm just finding my way into this in the way that you've been doing for the last 2 months, or in some cases years. And people sit in front of models and librettos and scores for absolutely years. They have it in their head, they're completely immersed in it, and then you sort of land in this world and you have to try and make it work on the spot. So you have to just remind everybody that we're just going through the process.
I'm intrigued by the variation though between the designers who will sit back and relax and let me get on with it. And it may be that I've worked with them quite a few times, but then I can think of at least one designer I've worked with many times who's got to be in there hands-on that very first light you turn on. And you try and say, look, my aim is to light the entire act in the next hour, and we get stuck on the first cue again, even though you've carefully said we've really got to get something in the desk ready for tomorrow's non-stop rehearsal. So I'm still battling with managing the different styles that people work in. But I do find it very interesting at the moment with designers, whether they're going to sit back or whether they're going to really be annoyingly involved at the wrong time. I haven't quite solved that yet.
So we'll move on and talk about your other collaborators, particularly like DSM. It's quite instrumental in what we do. Programmers and the rest of the lighting crew, and how you kind of see their role in terms of being part of the team, or in terms of kind of facilitating and helping what you do.
DSM. I'm going to be a bit patriotic here, so I think we have the best DSMs in the UK, in the world. It's extraordinary when you work abroad and the different approaches and different understanding of what a DSM is. And having come from the UK system where, well, I don't know about you guys, but I completely rely on DSM knowing what's going on. And then to go and work in France, where their understanding of DSM is something very different, and they don't actually hold any of the information. And in Germany, they're not even in the rehearsal room.
No?
So they know nothing, and they're just kind of basically data entry clerks, and they just do as they're told. That's a bit of a shock to the system. But for me, working in the sort of background I come from, DSM is absolutely essential. A true collaborator, and a really good one, has an artistic flair as well, and has a sensitivity to the piece, be that the script or the music, or will understand what it is you're trying to do. Fantastic.
Yeah, there's a big variation, which you've reminded me about overseas. I was just also in Denmark. The queuing, the show caller, DSM, doesn't come to any rehearsals. I persuaded him to come to a run through because it was really complicated. Meanwhile, the stage manager is the only person in the room all the time, doesn't come to any of the lighting sessions. And this was a massive set that was going to revolve. And I mean, where's the stage manager to sort out what's going on stage? Well, she doesn't come. So it's like totally dysfunctional. So I absolutely agree. We've got it sorted in the UK, generally, although I do see a bit of a variation.
Sure, of course.
And sometimes I think that the DSM I might have encountered at a drama school is way better than the DSM I encountered with some years of experience. But yeah, when they work, they're fantastic.
Yeah, the calling system here is much better than almost anywhere in Europe. The American system is the same as here, so it's but they all know what's going on. I mean, intrinsically, stage management, the DSM knows what's happening, and they're always a useful reference. But I mean, the programmer is the right hand on a big show. If I haven't got a programmer that I know and can rely just to get on with it, it takes me double the length of time, because then they can get on with all the work. You can just say, go and sort that bit out, and I'll go and bullshit the director for half an hour whilst they go and do it, or I'll cause some other fuss to happen so that you can get on with it. So you can get on with, let them get on with life, and you just try and sort out the road crash. But yes, without a good programmer, I'd be stuck.
I had, as part of my PhD, I'm doing a bit of field work, and I won a production a couple of weeks ago with a freelance programmer who's fantastic. And what she showed to me was that actually a programmer is more than just, they're more than just the person who puts the stuff into the desk.
Oh, no.
And but in terms of like people management and all sorts of things, and they'd the first day of tech had gone really quickly. It's a massive music one, it had gone really quickly, and everybody was going, we've gotten through this really fast. Like we've got a while, we can slow down. And she went, I'll just be really shit at programming today. And she said, and you know, if there's any recourse, I'll take the heat for it, and that'll be fine. And I thought, that is brilliant. Like, that is amazing. And like for a programmer to have that kind of sensitivity to the situation and to what's going on, I just thought, that's fantastic.
She's very bossy though.
We like being bossed around. I was wondering if it's the same person. Well, I saw with rather weak stage management, I saw this programmer really take control, and she drove the technical from the lighting desk.
But it's amazing, isn't it, when
Yeah.
you have somebody who can be that.
Huh?
Who's that?
Vicky.
I was about to mention Vicky. We're starting a sort of culture of programmer stroke associate almost,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
people like Vicky become so
Yeah.
involved in the process. You can't really, it's hard to go back after.
It is.
And I've just been, I mentioned I've been up at the Oslo Opera House, and they have 3 programmers who do morning, afternoon, and they swap in the evening. So
yeah.
you have 3 people, and you never see them because they don't ever bring the desk down, even though they haven't got facility to do it. So they're kind of this voice. It took me about 2 weeks to meet one of them.
Yeah.
Just this voice in the morning, Yannicka. And I couldn't really picture Yannicka. And when I finally saw her, she was completely wrong. I was like, you sounded like a huge. She's this tiny. And they didn't do anything unless I asked them to. So even marking moving lights, basic stuff, marking moving lights and getting scrollers set up. Didn't do it unless I say, you have noticed that light move. And they basically don't do anything for fear that you might have intended it. Whereas someone like Vic or Andy would just be constantly in the background sorting out stuff, and we'll also have a basic, very strong understanding of why you're doing the things you're doing, which makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's the massive difference, is that they're part of the team. If they can second guess, then great, because things happen much quicker, and you don't have to kind of waste time pointing things out. So that, you know, to not have a really good relationship where that they have some sort of creative input, I guess that's the trade-off when you have a good relationship, is you can allow they feel they have some sort of creative investment in what's going on, and they do all that thing, and they instinctively know what the boundaries are. I mean, that goes, you know, whether it's how and exactly when that cue is called by a DSM or whoever's on, if it's the person who's running the lighting, because it's basically a lighting show or whatever, but to have them, you know, them to know what the kind of parameters are, and have that sensitivity to it is kind of invaluable. Because like when you go somewhere and you don't have that, it's like, oh my God, this is such hard work.
But this is the problem. We haven't documented in any way what is the standard that we should get from a programmer. And this is probably not the right forum to discuss that. But there's such a variation on the caliber of programmer. Again, I think they're the best here. But it's too variable on the sort of relationship you can have. It's great when you can take your own, or cast the programmer, but in lots of organisations they're provided. And when you have to have that difficult conversation with the organisation and say your standard of programming isn't right, it's a difficult one.
I was thinking, people ask what they need to do to be programmers, and I always say, be a theatre maker first, because you can learn what the buttons do and what order you need to push them in to do things, but it's the other stuff that actually makes you a really good programmer and a really valuable part of that team. When you've got that sensitivity to the process, you can empathise with the other people in the process.
I did tell a fairly eminent opera house in Europe that their programmers needed more training and development. And as it was in Austria, it got translated into sort of a more of a death camp threat, I think. So, of course, when I gave the feedback in a very nice way, and clearly when I unexpectedly went back to do another opera, it had been translated in a different way to the shop floor. I worked along the line saying hello to the 5 programmers. That was one of the problems. And the young one, who hadn't been there before, shook my hand warmly. I got to the far end to the chief, who was the most useless programmer, and he said, "Scheisse!" and didn't shake my hand. And I thought, well, I wonder if I misheard him. And he would always be scheduled to do the most difficult days, whereas the very brilliant young one was only allowed to do the days where he turned the working lights on at the beginning and off at the end. Then it's a struggle trying to put a show on.
Should we talk about the rest of the electrics team as well? So, just the electricians and people that follow spot operator. Yeah.
We're, without decent follow spot operators, you can be sunk so often. The most unsung heroes of the show, I think, the follow spot operators. In North America, they get a living wage, and but sometimes they're crap as well. Actually, quite often they're crap. But they get a living wage, and they have a certain pride in trying to be follow spot operators. Whereas here, we are so lucky to get good ones. We get great follow spot operators, but I just think they're the unsung heroes of the things that I do. And also, having somebody on the production week that can actually communicate with the follow spot operators is pretty invaluable as well. So normally I'll have somebody who can do follow spot calling, which usually is the touring chief, becomes the touring chief of the show. So I have a programmer and the touring chief with me, and the touring chief would call the follow spots. And if you've got that relationship, it's good, and then it can be really, really useful. But yeah, without decent follow spot operators, just some.
And a decent production electrician as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Someone who volunteers solutions.
Well,
So it's-
again, a production electrician, when it goes up and works, another unsung hero, because you know that you think, what have they done? But it all works, and that's the thing you want. You want to turn up on the Monday, and them not turning around and saying, well, actually, bars 2 and 3 have got a DMX fault, and so and so's got a problem with this, that, and the other. The great production electricians, everything just is up and working, and it appears to be no effort. But you know there's a hell of a lot of effort gone into it, and hire companies and all the rest of the backup, it all comes down to teamwork with that.
It's kind of people using different parts of their heads as well, isn't it? I think because for me, like, the job that production electrician does just fills me with dread. The logistics
Yeah.
and the sort of weight of the work. Sometimes I just go, oh God, I'm not even sure if I want to give the note. Please, I really, really want to take down those 16 vibes and put something else up instead. And there's certain listeners who say, yeah, fine, the replacements are on the
Black
truck
Cobra,
already. I knew
really.
you were going to say that, and it's kind of just, it's not a problem. And I just go, it's great. It's such an amazing feeling. But, that doesn't always happen. For those of you who ask back, of course, they have that shorthand. Again, you just really, really value.
Well, I think collaborators is often used exclusively to refer to creatives, but a collaborator is someone. The definition of collaboration is at least 2 people, and maybe up to however many, working together. So all these people are collaborators, and now whether that extends to making them feel like, as we say about the programmer, as they can have some sort of creative input or investment in it. Some people aren't interested in that, but I think we have to acknowledge that there's a team of people, they're all collaborators. Then there's, creative collaborators, but the definition of collaborator is at least 2 people working together to do something.
Absolutely.
In a sort of cooperative kind of, in a spirit of cooperation and sort of support.
I think as well, because I feel personally that we have the responsibility to let people know that they are able to contribute as well. Because I've been in a situation where board operators, I won't say who or where, but was keeping very quiet and not really offering anything, and it turned out that he had run into trouble with the previous lighting designer because he'd been basically too opinionated, and someone had lodged a complaint about it. I thought it was a real shame. I mean, personally, I love it when there's another set of creative eyes looking at the stage. I love it when a DSM says, I think it'd be better if I was called that a bar earlier, and it works, and that's fantastic. Just people who've got another set of eyes, another set of ears, that's always only going to be useful, and you don't have to take it. You can disagree, of course. But yeah, but I think people need to know that they're okay to do that.
Yeah. Have you got in-house staff who really know the venue that they're working in really well and can offer you some alternate solutions if something you've put up somewhere doesn't quite work? They can say, oh, we could try such and such a thing that we did on 3 shows ago or whatever. Yeah.
I think the big opera houses, the lighting supervisor who wants to help is invaluable. You know, where you're overwhelmed by this huge rig, and they'll come up and give you a little tip about somewhere that there's a light that can get somewhere that you really need to get.
Can we go back to the language thing? Like it's about what do we mean by collaboration? And often, that's like I'm saying, excludes some people, but actually, when is putting a live show on not a collaboration? But for me, so that's a kind of given, and as a team, but just for me, a collaboration is when A does something that changes what B does, and B does something that changes what C does, and C does something that changes what A does. Otherwise, that's what I consider real collaboration. Of course, like I just said, it's all collaboration. It's a team of people kind of working together. On the way here, I was trying to think of an instance where putting on a live performance wasn't collaboration. I mean, it depends about the process. But
I call that a despite experience,
yeah.
where you get the show on despite the non-collaborator in the room.
Just a thought there that maybe it's creativity that we're limiting, the meaning of the word creativity, because after all, to schedule if you're a chief on a big opera house, to schedule a crew to have the right people there at the right time takes a distinct amount of creativity to be able to get all those lights up in the air at the right time with the people that you've got in the order that you have to do it in, because the master carpenter is being a bit of an arse. That takes some creativity, and I think we need to acknowledge that is creative, that our technical collaborators are also creative.
Should we, what, 10 minutes? Should we do questions from the audience, if anybody's got any? We can keep rambling on for a bit. Yeah?
I think most of you have referred to working outside the UK, so how does that change the communication between all the people that you just talked about? Because you might be working with Germans in the States or whatever. So
There's another layer of complexity when you're already talking about something that's really hard to talk about.
yeah, exactly.
But also, that it's in a funny sort of way. It also means that you have to think really carefully through. Assuming, because I don't speak, I have a little bit of French now, but I don't really speak anything else apart from English. So I'm usually using English, but at a much more basic level. And it means you have to think really carefully through what you mean, because you've got to try and be succinct and clear with the language that you have at your disposal. And that's really helpful. I find it really helpful. You kind of have to say, what exactly is it that I'm trying to say in my head? And yeah, that's quite an interesting experience.
Another question?
Another thing that I noticed was that you're talking an awful lot about what I call interpersonal skills. So, when I teach my students, I actually think that, half of the job is rigging a light, making it work. But actually, as a production electrician myself, I actually think half of my job is appeasing a grumpy production carpenter, or dealing with the in-house staff that aren't the easiest people in the world to do. And a lot of you are talking about developing these skills? Do you think that's something we should be encouraging? I certainly encourage it when I teach. I call it interpersonal skills, just knowing how to talk to somebody and not diffusing the situation rather than exacerbating it type thing. And I think that you're talking about being particularly skilled in that area, working with directors. I just wondered what your opinion was on that.
Like, it's vital, essential. Yeah, you're not going to go. I don't think you're going to go far or anywhere or whatever unless you've got a highly developed, way of communicating and making that person feel good. Whether it or saying, not now, but come back. This is like the equivalent of the first day in rehearsal to make it understandable to someone. But yes, you can see people who are quite brilliant at what they do, but the way that they come across is just like awful, and then you realise that they're not. That's a real kind of handicap, not just necessarily at that moment, but for them as an individual. You've got to be able to kind of cajole and persuade and charm to be able to make things kind of happen, and to make people feel that they want to, go that extra mile or whatever. And when you work with people like that, that's a real, joy to work with them.
It's quite a hard thing to teach. I find it quite hard to teach, but I think it's really important because you could be the geekiest programmer in the world, but it might not be with someone that you necessarily want to sit next to for 12-hour days for 5 days. And unfortunately, the person that's slightly more interpersonal and a little bit more social potentially get the phone call over the guy that knows every soft key that you can possibly potentially get round the situation. Would you? Is that something that you would consider when hiring someone? Just a social presence, or just a?
Well, you say you've got to sit with them for 5 days.
That's how I feel about it.
I would prefer to sit with somebody that I got on socially as well than a complete nerd that I couldn't talk to. But unfortunately, I do work with quite a few nerds, but I can normally have fun with them.
Experienced hand.
You've got to find ways, haven't you?
The two things that are essential. We can't have someone who's got great interpersonal skills but keeps going, oh, my fat fingers. I've worked with that programmer. Oh, my fat fingers every time you plunge the stage into play. But it was great to have a chat. Versus the complete nerd. You've got to bring both skills together. And when we talk about the formidable programmers, it's the ones that can do both.
We also have a sort of broad understanding of making theatre. What you touched on,
Yeah.
I think, that's true, but any theatre practitioner will get an understanding of what the other departments are going through and what might be happening on stage at any given time. It's a few different aspects. I had another really good point, but I've forgotten it. I'm sorry.
And also look at the bigger picture. No, it isn't actually all about the lights, although we'd like to think it is. It is about the lights.
I love the ones who also bring calmness into the room by saying, it's going to be okay, I've got that sorted, it's already in the truck, waiting. All of those people who've thought for you. But there is a very fine line about the thinking for you. Years and years ago, when I was putting lights up for lighting designers, the computerised lighting desk had just been invented, and we had a monitor. Remember Paul at Glyndon? And when you put the channel up, the light would flash. And we were very modern because we got a monitor down on the lighting designer's desk. And it wasn't the days now where we can have a sequence of lights as a system. It was all a jumble of channel numbers. And I was sitting programming for David Hersey, and I would just call up the next number he was going to ask for. I'd be inside his head, but I wouldn't put it up. And one day he noticed that the next light he was going to ask for was already flashing on the screen. And he said, okay, Marco, give us 77. And I went, at 60, because I knew that's the level he wanted at. Anyway, some years later, I saw the same lighting design, and I was just watching what was going on. And the programmer at the National was being a bit too zealous in his helpfulness. He said, David would be going "Rrr," as he tried to work out what number it was, and he would go "Rrr" for a bit. And unfortunately, the program went 76 out of 17. Well, I do wish you wouldn't do that. It's really annoying. And so it just reminded me that it's a great art to find how far to help and when to help and when to just wait. It's really annoying if the programmer knows the number and they're waiting to see if you can tell them what it is when you can't. But it's a
Tell
great
the colour,
yeah.
not the number.
It's a great art to just knowing when to help. And I'm not trying to blow my trumpet. I just didn't put the channel up until he asked me. But I knew that's what David wanted. And the unfortunate thing for your programmer is that he'd overstepped the mark with the other lighting designer by the sound of it. And that then reacted on the way you wanted to work with him. So again, the programmer has to be the chameleon in the way they work with us, because we're probably all a bit different in what we want to do and how we want to do it.
Do you not find that quite a lot of it can be unspoken communication?
Yeah.
There's a programmer I worked with recently that I just leaned back and went, and he'd already grabbed the blue channel and started dialing that down a bit for me, which is essentially what I wanted, although I didn't know it at the time. You can kind of just lean back and go, thank God you did that, because I didn't know what I needed.
It's also when the lighting designer and the programmer don't agree with the director, and the two of you collude to look like you're not really.
Well, that's the argument where they become almost an associate. Your programmer is starting with certain things because they know what you want to do, or you've talked to them about it, so they've channeled it in the way you want it, so they know, and they can make those choices for you. You can say, can you fix that bloody colour while I go and talk to the director, So they are becoming your associate, I think.
So general question, let's kind of shift this slightly. I like to understand the anecdotes of good shows and bad shows and things. So given we talk about language, are the best shows the one where you've all got on? Or not necessarily? This whole kind of search for the right language. Comments on that? What makes it the best project? Is it the drinks afterwards? Is it like, wow, something new in lighting design? What is it? What's the best?
It doesn't necessarily follow that it's a good show is a pleasant experience. It doesn't necessarily follow at all.
Okay.
But having said that, I just one example popped into my head. I did Bugsy Malone a couple of years ago at Lyric, and right at the beginning of that project, the director, Sean Holmes, said, "I'd like everybody to come and get involved right at the very beginning of this. I want you all to come to my house in the country, lucky you, and we'll just sit down and have a weekend, we'll get drunk, and we'll just talk about the show." And it was fantastic, because for a lighting designer, unless you're Mark Holt, you don't often get to be on there the first day of rehearsal. My experience is more like Nick's. You can't very often given a fait accompli. Now, I can't say that the show was better for it, but the experience was fantastic, because we all were singing from the same hymn sheet, kind of for us. I just understood much more about the decisions that John, the designer, and Sean were making, just because I've been there at those early conversations. And that conversation we had in that house in the countryside, I don't know, 10-20% of that made it to the stage in the end, and a lot was thrown out. But crucially, I had the sort of spirit of the show under my belt. I sort of knew what the deal was, in a way that I don't think I've ever experienced before, and that was fantastic. And the show was a dream to make. I don't think there was a raised voice or a stressed moment really. And that was with 3 teams of kids. That was it was hard going.
I could see Jo Town shaking her head vigorously when you were asking the question. That was it a pleasant experience?
Not always, is it?
No.
But sometimes it does produce your best work.
Yes.
When it's a struggle.
When it's a struggle.
Yeah.
Could you dig so deep?
Sad.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
When you get pushed.
I like it when the work's good and you've had a nice time. And that's usually because you've all got on and you've had good communication, good interpersonal skills, all across. But they're rare, I think.
But you can have good communication but not necessarily all agree about it.
Yeah.
So it pushes you all in to
Yeah.
an area you weren't imagining it would go, or to a better place. You can communicate that well. Your disagreements can communicate well, I think.
I'm not sure this is a very good question. And actually, that's kind of ironic to talk about language. But Kelly, I was really interested about what you were saying about the use of different types of English language at the beginning. And I've kind of been thinking about that quite a lot, about the way that I speak in different scenarios. And I kind of also wonder whether I adapt my language too much at the production desk between a programmer and a prodigy and a designer and a director. Like I wonder whether a director ever hears me speaking in a very matter-of-fact, bish-bash-bosh way to a programmer, and then kind of thinks, oh God, is she being a bit patronising? You know, like, and I'm just wondering whether anyone's got any other feelings about that, about how different we make our language.
And if I may add to that, also, if you we should talk about the conduit as well. How does a good relationship with the rest of the creative team affect, or how is that affected by a bad relationship with the technical team, or the other way around? Do you, like you were saying about the director interpreting your communications with the technical team being bad, if I can use that word, but what if it is actually bad? Are you conscious of that, or do you try and work around that, or how does it affect you?
A lot of the time, when you're talking to your team, you're usually on a headset, so the director and designer don't normally hear what you're saying to them, basically. But so there is a thing where there's silence, and you are giving instructions, but directors and designers are not party to it because you're talking to the DSM and the programmer over the headset, basically. So there's a funny stop-start thing about that. You have to be careful about what you're saying in proximity, I think, if you're having difficulties. You have to try to be as diplomatic as possible, but it's sort of it can be very difficult sometimes when you're being asked to do something you don't like to do or don't want to do particularly. But it's sort of you have to moderate everything, I think, so it boils down to.
I did a show for my fieldwork where the director was actually on cans.
Really? Never do that. Never
never do that. And I've been transcribing it, and it's really interesting to see how the lighting designer, how there are like 4 different conversations going on, and the lighting designer keeps track of every single one of them, as does the programmer. So the programmer's talking to the lighting designer and the DSM, and they're keeping track of both conversations at the same time, while the lighting designer is talking to the programmer and to the director. And like just weaving that thread through I think it's quite skillful, really, keeping all that information in your head and being able to make sure everybody's got the information that they need.
I think there's a non-verbal communication that sometimes comes in there. If the director's asking for something that you don't want to do, you can communicate that to your programmer verbally so the director can hear you, but you can be doing something different with your eyes towards your programmer, so that they know either to, and if it's someone you work with a lot, to make the idea look shit once they put it up, so that the director goes, oh no, that was a bad idea.
Oh yeah, can you make that 10% brighter? Oh yeah, I've done that. Yeah, oh that looks much better.
Yeah.
You've not touched the desk at all. Yeah.
Well, yeah, your programmer taps the buttons, but actually,
yeah.
But let's say that you come into a situation where the director says, oh, this is not at all what I had imagined, it was talking about earlier, and coerces you to make some changes in the rig with almost no time to do it. And you have to rely on the technical team to be able to do it. And say that they're sympathetic to your situation, that's good. But if they're not, how do you work around that? I mean, essentially, how do you how does that affect? If you're being very annoyed by the creative team, how does that affect your communications with the technical team? Or if the technical team is driving you mad, and you constantly have to go to the creative team and say, "I'm very sorry, but there is a reason for why X, Y, and Z hasn't happened, and that is because." You don't want to be constantly saying that in the whole production process. So
no, you take the director away to one side and say, "Listen, I'm really sorry. we're having a shit time with a rig or whatever it is, you just have to give us the space and the time to sort it out. But you do that separately. You don't include everybody in on that. You don't tell the production staff that in fact you're having a terrible time. You just have to separate. But that's the only time that you do it, really.
But you don't think it influences your the way you communicate?
Yeah, absolutely it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might start lying about
Yeah, regularly lying.
yeah. No, but I think a lot of this is not exclusive to the activity that we're engaged in. It's generally about groups of people at work and how they get on. I mean, somebody once, there's a theory that a group functions best when there's a scapegoat. That's one of the functions of being in a group. Now, that might be the answer to the question. That although they really don't want, the crew see the predicament you're in because they can identify the scapegoat in this whole kind of group, and that enables them to go, no, it's all right, we'll take tea a bit later, but we'll sort that out, now or whatever.
But the scapegoat could be with the producer.
Yes,
I mean, normally it's a producer. But in my case, which is built in, right? No,
but some people can't function without it. Goes beyond being the scapegoat. It's being the bête noire, and that some people can't function. Thinking one particular choreographer I've worked with quite a lot, not recently, who seemed incapable of, and there was a kind of purpose in some. I don't think it was a deliberate strategy, but. It's the kind of football manager strategy of creating a kind of strong group of people because you insist that everybody else is against you. And so you create this kind of monster, but then you can all be like in it together, and there's the horrible monster over there. And yeah.
I think there's some truth in that. There's a certain eminent director who definitely has a scapegoat in the room, and it's somebody different every day, but somebody gets it and it's for the day.
Right.
And it gets shared around, so you're not sort of...
The choreographer I'm thinking of is for the project.
For the project?
Yeah.
Right. But then the next project, it might be someone else? Or
it's usually a producer.
And the opera director I'm thinking of would fire somebody on every production. We'd all keep our heads down, waiting to see who's going to be the scapegoat this time. And they'd be fired. Costume design got it quite a few times. Lighting did get it, but it wasn't me that time. I had to let him go. We weren't on the same page, said the director to me. I went, oh. But you get through that and you go, well, I survived.
On that cheery note, we have to wrap it up there.
Oh no, end it on a more cheery note than I survived.
I have a tiny little question. I'm really interested. You talk about creatives and technical, and that, to me, more creative and more technical. I mean, is there this line? Maybe we need a break. It's a long question. I don't understand why there's that separation because creativity is, resilient, everything. So there is, I think, an issue with language about creativity as well.
I think maybe we might talk
But
about
that's
that in the
probably,
next,
no, that's after.
the next panel. Yeah, we'll
It's
cover
up
that
to the
next panel.
person to define it for themselves. And some people want to be technical, they don't want to be creative. Some people are creative and they don't want to be technical. Some people have, want to be both.
What about art?
But they are creative in their
by
technical
means?
Oh, sorry.
Art by a technical means?
Yeah.
I mean, we have to engage both sides of the brain.
Cool, we really will have to stop there.
Okay.
So thanks very much.